Hi everyone, Sarah Whiting here with St. John's Church Foundation. Today I'm very excited to have as our special guest Lee Ball. Welcome, Lee.
Hi there, Sarah.
Good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
I'm very excited to have Lee here. Lee has been our volunteer on our graveyard identification project. And Lee, I was looking over my notes, and the first time you and I corresponded was in November of 2018.
Wow.
We're very lucky that you've been helping us for these many years. When we first reached out to you, we really needed help figuring out who is in the graveyard, how many people are in the graveyard, sorting through all these mounds of information we have. And you were gracious and lovely and stepped forward.
Well, it's been a fun project. I've enjoyed working on it, and a lot of other people have worked on this over time. I'm not sure how far back it extends, but I'm sure a number of people, both from the foundation and probably the church, have worked on this over a long number of years.
Yeah, absolutely. I had in my notes here to clarify that you're the foundation's volunteer, but we owe a lot to the church archives. There have been their volunteers there, John King, Patty Tobler, uh, Judith Sherman. And Judith wrote the book, literally.
Judith wrote this book right here. I have it right here. It is now falling apart. I've used it so many times. She's got a list of people who were buried in the churchyard, along with their dates of birth and dates of death to the extent that she could find them. She's also got a filing cabinet full of folders backing up this information, and I use those extensively in the work that I'm doing.
So you could say that the foundation's work, we're standing on the shoulders of giants.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
That is literally true. And I'd like to give a special shout out to John King as well, because John King, over 30 years, made up little index cards like this one, but he went around and 30 years ago, went out into the churchyard and recorded the exact inscription on all the gravestones and memorial markers. And he was literally correct. He included exact line spacing, whether a word was capitalized or lowercase, whether a TH in October 5th was superscripted, the long S, what looks like an italic F to us maybe, all that got recorded and is the most correct transcription that we have of the gravestones in the churchyard.
Yeah.
And he went out to look at some of these since then, and many of them that he recorded 30 years ago no longer are readable, and in some cases they don't exist at all.
Wow.
They were maybe in a storm or something, and it's really great that we have these. I'm in the process now. I think I was up to about W in the alphabet when I left the foundation office prior to the coronavirus, in transcribing these and digitizing, fancy word for typing them in. But eventually we want to put all this information on the web so that it's not just sitting on 3x5 cards someplace. It's actually, this is important information that should be accessible to everybody. And let's have a website where people can get to it.
Yeah, so basically your role has been the wrangler or the person to corral all this data. We've got, I'll show you my book. This is the Bible that we've been using. This was a book in 1904, the Annals of the Henrico Parish.
Henrico Parish, exactly,
which,
yes.
Which does have some graveyard data, but it's what, to piggyback on what you said, the ephemeral nature of the graves and 100 and 200 years of tombstones falling apart. We're losing those inscriptions.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really sad. I went to Boston last year, and there are 3 colonial era cemeteries in Boston that are 100 years older than St. John's. And you go through the churchyard, the cemeteries there, and the gravestones are remarkably readable because they're all made of slate.
Yeah.
At St. John's are largely made of granite, marble, sandstone, none of which weather very well over time. And about 40% by my count of the gravestones either are partially or totally unreadable. In some cases, we have just a fragment, about the size of your hand. It's all that exists anymore. And it's really sad to see them. So our little 3x5 cards are about all that exists. And if we want to preserve those, we need to get them into some other medium where they're, have a longer lasting duration and are more widely accessible.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I am not a historian by background. I am a CPA. I started to work back in, 1973 for the Department of Defense. In 1979, I went to NASA. Both positions were as an auditor. And I finished my career at the NASA Office of Inspector General at the Langley Research Center. Did work at some of the other centers as well. Spent about a year at the Johnson Space Center and had a wonderful career there, really enjoyed it, and was able to retire at age 55, enjoyed being an auditor, but now I enjoy being retired, being able to travel, do volunteer work.
That's so cool. What do you think in your background has helped you be the detective and the sorter of all this information?
Well, to a CPA, every problem is solved by a spreadsheet. All this information goes in a spreadsheet. The spreadsheet will eventually migrate to probably a Microsoft Access database and then go up on the web. So I think when you're an auditor, you're curious about things. You delve into things that you usually don't really totally understand in the beginning, and you accumulate information and eventually gain additional knowledge and you reach some sort of a conclusion. And that's kind of what we're doing here, sort of. We will never know. We will never know how many people are buried in the churchyard. I've got an idea of how many I think may be there, but we'll never actually know. And there's a certain amount of beauty in preserving history, and I enjoy doing that. The people at the church and the foundation are just wonderful to work with. I have fun with them. Judith is usually there on Tuesdays when I'm there. John's always there. Have a good time. It's a collaborative effort, and I'm kind of an introvert by just the way I'm made up. And this is a chance to go out and work with other people. And so it's another dimension to my life, and that's pretty cool.
Well, you have added so much to this project, just, collaborating with the church volunteers, getting us organized. We had an Excel spreadsheet, and when you first started, and I was looking at my notes, we had something like 868 people on that spreadsheet. But over the, years of your work, you found duplicates, and you want to talk about finding new people?
By virtue of putting all the information together, we've now got 819 identified names of people that we know the names of. We're pretty sure buried in the churchyard. There are another 174 illegible names that are on the memorial markers. There are 265 graves that we can read, another 174 that are illegible. Probably some of those illegible names are mixed into our 819. And by virtue of having the inscriptions digitized, if we can go out into the churchyard and just read a few characters on the partially readable markers, we can then key those into the spreadsheet using wildcards and some other Excel type tricks and come up with maybe 4 or 5 names and inscriptions that partially readable tombstone may be. And then if you know what the words are supposed to be, you can discard maybe 3 of the 4 and narrow it down to 1 or 2. And then with a little detective work, you can figure out, oh, this is actually John Smith, born in 1739, died in 1745 or whatever. Figure out exactly what it is.
That is so cool. You're a detective. It's kind of like playing that game Concentration. Did you ever play that when you were a kid?
Yeah, we've actually identified several people this way. And John and I hoped after the weather turned warm, probably today, if we were back at the foundation office, we may be touring the churchyard with our little computer in hand and typing in little character strings to try to figure out who's buried where.
What does it feel like for you when you match?
It's a real, you solved a problem. It's a eureka moment. You know, we didn't know something, and then, you know, by the process of elimination, good detective work, you figure out who it is. You can determine who's, you can read something that you couldn't read before and know that, hey, this is a known person that is buried at this spot. And that's really cool. You know, the families of these deceased people put the marker there because they wanted these people to be remembered. And if you don't know the person's name of who's buried at that spot, well, that, you know, that memory is kind of gone. And if you can bring that back, that's really something very good, I think.
That's really cool. That's so meaningful. And for my thinking, when we identify people, actually all this information you're gathering, that just helps us tell the story, the full story of Richmond by the graveyard, because St. John's was the first graveyard in Richmond and first public cemetery. But we can also tell the individual stories as well.
Yeah, it's at the end, it's all about people, and people are stories, and people are interesting stories, and that's worth telling for sure.
Well, one of the things, not to turn people into spreadsheets, but one of the most fascinating things I think you've done for us is you've made these amazing spreadsheets by taking your these graphs, rather, by taking your spreadsheets and helping figure out. This one is deaths by gender and age, and we can share this later. But I guess it's not very surprising to see that you know, infant mortality is definitely off the charts. Are there any lessons that you learned from putting these together?
Well, one of them is there's another chart that shows death by date. And one of the really interesting things we know from the historical record that the cemetery was filled by 1820. And that led to the next public cemetery, Shockoe Hill, being opened in 1822. But the recorded deaths that we have, the vast majority of them for which we have data, occurred after 1820.
Yeah.
So the folks of the church said, hey, our churchyard is filled 1820, and yet they continue to bury people in the churchyard at a pretty fast clip after 1820.
We've got the proof.
We do. And the records, the church has no recorded records, is my understanding, prior to 1826. So most of the data that we have, other than what's on the markers themselves, most of the recorded data that we have occurred after 1826. And between 1826 and 1836, got a little bit of data for 1826, but between 1826 and 1836, the records were removed from the church vestry book. They don't exist anymore. I hope they show up in somebody's attic one day as somebody's going through where they are. But then between 1826 and later, then we have some fairly decent reported burial information. So how did they continue to bury people after the churchyard was filled? And it plays into how many people are actually buried in the churchyard. I think it's a pretty significant number, more than, we've only got 439 markers. We know that 819 people so far have got documented names. I think the true number may be between 2,000 and 3,000, just on, you know, some back of the envelope type calculations about the maximum capacity of the churchyard, and the fact that we know from the historical record that there were serial or stacked burials, people buried on one on top of the other. And it's also confirmed by ground penetrating radar studies that have been done. So I think by the time you account for all that, not unreasonable to assume that there may be between 1,500, 3,000 people buried here. The majority of which, if that's the case, the majority of which will never know the names of those people.
Yeah, unless people discover things in their attics or
True. And if we put this information on the web, hopefully we'll have some feedback mechanism where we can get some crowdsourcing information, and that's pretty helpful as well.
Amen. I know personally that we've been able to identify some graves by old photographs. We had that problem where there was a woman, Ann Benson or Ann Denson, and we couldn't figure
Yes,
out
right, yeah.
because there were multiple records with her last name being started with a B or a D, but then we found a photograph, and sure enough, we were able to focus in on it, and she's Denson, right? Or
Correct, yes.
so nothing like a photo. So I would, boy, I'd like to put a pitch out there. If anybody has pictures in your attic of St. John's, please, we would love to see them, even if they're from tourist pictures from the 70s or 80s. All information is great.
It's strange how much information or how many of the gravestones have deteriorated in the past, say, 30, 40 years or so.
Right.
So if people have earlier photos of the churchyard, that would be great if they could share that.
And also, if we get emails on occasion from people who talk about their relatives in the graveyard, so any information on if someone's related to a person there, by all means, I would say give us the information, because it may not be in Judith's magic file. Anything we
exactly. Yes.
Now you mentioned briefly the ground penetrating radar project, and I'm gonna interview Brian Whiting, who is the professor who did that work. But you spent a couple weeks last August sort of helping him. What was that like?
Well, it was just actually one day. I think I was there the rest of the week, but I was only there one day. That I had never seen ground penetrating radar equipment. It turns out it looks like a pretty fancy high-tech lawnmower that you just push across the area that you're trying to assess what's underneath. It requires a great deal of setup. It uses a very sophisticated system of, I think, cellular data, of Wi-Fi, and the global positioning satellite system. Mm-hmm. So I spent, I think, the better part, maybe I helped out on 2 days. I can't remember it now. No, there's one day of setup and probably another day that I actually went with him as he actually conducted the survey. And there was a graduate student from from VCU who helped. And it was fun. It was something that I had never done before, and it was pretty cool. And he's got a fairly thick report that he's issued that talks about the findings.
Yeah, so I think it's kind of cool. You got to put some hours in the field after working in the background on all the charts and graphs and spreadsheets. It's pretty cool.
It's the only way to actually kind of see what's under the ground. I mean, you just can't do that normally. And this is, and I, quite frankly, I look at the pictures of what he's got. It looks like just, a series of sonic waves. It doesn't mean a great deal to me, but he's got a PhD in this sort of thing, and he can, actually discern what these images actually mean and make a meaningful interpretation of them. So it's kind of fun to read the results as well and try to, figure out what's going on here.
Well, without giving away the punchline, he was able to, sure enough, prove what we already thought. They're everywhere.
Exactly, yes. Yeah.
People are everywhere. And we raised the money to get him to come back to sort of do part 2 of the ground penetrating radar project. So we'll have to wait and see if he's able to come this summer. If not, we'll postpone it. But everything that you're doing and what he's doing is creating this amazing picture of the historic resource and of the graveyard. It's just spectacular. And I guess I didn't say this. I should have started off by saying, thank you, Lee. Thank you for all these hours of work.
Well, I do it because I'm having fun and I think I'm contributing to something. And it's all pretty cool. And I really enjoy working with you and the other folks at the foundation and the church. They're all good guys.
Well, I enjoy working with you a lot. You have brought so much to the table. So thank you.
Well, thanks. Oh, let me add one other thing here. We didn't cover this. Even though the first grave goes back to 1747, at least the first one that we know about, probably St. John's, unlike any other cemetery of this era, burials are continuing up until the current time. The
Right.
last what I have listed in my spreadsheet is 2019, last year. They're not actually burials, but now there is we have facilities for the cremains. People are being cremated now. And there's a columbarium, which is, well, I think only maybe 25% filled. So people are still being interred at St. John's Cemetery.
I am so glad you brought that up. A lot of people don't know that. So that's wonderful. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, and St. John's is still an active church, so and active congregation and active burials in the columbarium.
Which contributes to the stories. We've got people from the American Revolution. One of the people that I just happened to come across when I was doing research and going through Judith's files, mainly because his last name is an A, Claxton Allen, was an electrical engineer for General Electric and finished his career as a vice president of Westinghouse and made important contributions to transformers and circuit breakers, things that we use every day. So we've got people that run the gamut from over the time spectrum. So that's another cool aspect of St. John's Church.
Yeah, that is cool. That's great. More stories to come.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Lee. I really appreciate you coming on and talking to me. And I can't wait till we can get you back in there again. And
Well, I enjoyed it. And in the meantime, stay safe.
you too. All right. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.